with me. And that we are hoping that our conversations that we have on this show blesses you as they bless me. And I wanted to just give a few highlights or announcements. You know how we do in church, y'all have announcements. So I'm going to have some announcements today before we jump into our show. The first is I want to make certain that you like Because of His Grace Ministries on Facebook. That is so important to keep encouraging me and for us to stay connected. So if you haven't already, please check out Because of His Grace Ministries on Facebook and like us, follow us, because there are a lot of new and exciting things that are going to start happening as we go through this year in 2019. And so I want you to stay connected and be informed so that you don't miss out on anything great that we have going on. And also, I want you to save the date for Friday, April 26th and Saturday, April 27th. It is our second annual women's retreat, and I am so very excited because last year's retreat was absolutely powerful, and it was our first one. So this year, the second one, it's got to be even greater. And we are praying about it and preparing and praying that women will come. And it's specifically for women because there's something about women coming together. When we get together, we can pray together, cry, laugh, and share stories with one another and encourage each other. So if you're interested, save the date for Friday, April 26th. And Saturday, April 27th. The tickets will go on sale in February. And some of our speakers, we will have the Reverend Tamika Reed Sims. She's going to be our keynote speaker. If you don't know her, check her out. She is absolutely fabulous in delivering the Word of God. And then our other speakers will be Dr. Heather Burton. You may remember her from one of our interviews a while ago when she was talking about relationships and contentment. She is going to be one of our speakers. And then Michelle Crawford from Antioch Baptist Church is another speaker. And what is our theme? Our theme is Peace in Stormy Weather, Staying Anchored Through Prayer. And it's based on my devotional book, 25 Lessons I Learned While Weathering the Storms of Life. And it's a truth of the matter is that storms come. No matter when we are, where we are, they come. Sometimes we're in the middle of a storm, we're walking out of a storm, or we're right dead smack in the middle of one and leaving one. So we've got to figure out how to weather the storms of life. So definitely hold that date of Friday, April 26th and Saturday, April 27th, so that we can talk about how do we have peace in the midst of the storms and how do we stay anchored through prayer. I'm excited and prayerful at the same time. Now, on to our show today. We are talking about how to deal with grief gracefully. That's right. How do we deal with grief gracefully? The reality of life is that we cannot escape it without losing a loved one. That is just a fact. But how do we deal with it? How do we grow through it? How do we thrive in spite of it? And where is Yah in the midst of it? Because I know sometimes as believers, we become disillusioned when a loved one dies, especially when we have prayed about their healing, or when they die suddenly, or from whether it's from a chronic disease, or whether it's from an accident, or whether it's from the violence that is so prevalent in our society today. How do we deal with it? And how do we grow through it? And in the studio today is a dear friend of mine. I call her Beth, but she likes to be called Elizabeth, and I just found that out today. So it's my friend Elizabeth Sump, and she is going to share her story about her grief and how she has learned to live through it and grow through it and the lessons that she's learned. Now, I will tell you, I've heard her story, and she has blessed me. And I am prayerful that her story will bless you. And it's not just for you, but for you to also share with others. And so, Beth, thank you so much for being here.
You know, Natalie, I'm very pleased, and I'm honored, and I'm humbled to be here to talk about this, because I think it's such an important topic. Mm-hmm. I joke about, they always say there's nothing for sure in this world except death and taxes. But the fact is that the other thing that's positive, that's absolutely going to happen to you at some point in this world, is you are going to suffer a loss.
Right.
At some point during your life, and it may be a loved one, it may be your job, it may be your home, it may be the death of a dream of yours. But at some point, something's going to level you. And what happens to your life after that
Right.
is going to be largely based on how you cope with that loss, whatever it is. And so I, I'm so honored to have you talk to me about this. I think the first thing to step through, though, is that I'm of the opinion there's nothing graceful about grieving. It's not graceful. It's not pretty. It's icky, and it's stumbling, and it is the most humble human experience that I think any of us goes through. And yet, I think with mindfulness, with intention, it's an opportunity for growth.
Right. And I think that, Beth, is where the grace comes in.
Sure.
Because you have a traumatic event where you lose a loved one, and you learn how to then live life without them, your new normal.
Right.
And you learn to grow through it every day and every moment of every day. And that's where grace comes in.
Absolutely.
And that's where the title for me just resonates.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you deal with it gracefully? Because many individuals can get stuck.
Yeah.
They can get stuck through the grieving process, and then because that loved one is gone, life ends for them.
Right.
But it doesn't have to. And that's where, for me, from a spiritual aspect, and me being a strong believer in Yahweh and His Word, is that His Word says that He will never leave us nor forsake us. So even as we deal with the loss of a loved one, He is right there, giving us the strength to carry on. And
That's
so
exactly
that's
right.
where the grace comes in. And I know not everybody can embrace that, because there are some people that are watching and listening that are in the midst of losing a loved one. I think about my dear friend Sabrina Mickle, whose brother was killed from police violence just recently.
Yeah.
And in the midst of all of the grief that they're experiencing now, they don't feel the grace. They may not feel it, but at some point, as we move through it and grow through it, the grace shows up, and Beth, it embraces us,
does.
right? To help us to then go on to the next day. And it's really one day at a time. Now, we jumped way into this before.
It's okay. We're going to dive right in.
Dive right in, and thank you. But before we go on into your personal story, because it's very clear and evident that you're passionate about this because you've lived it. But before we dive into that, tell us just a few things that you like to do, that makes you laugh, that brings life to you. Help us to get to know you. And
laugh, and laughter is super important, right? I mean, I think, what do I like to do? Gosh, so I work at the clinic. Or at the Cleveland Clinic. I do technology development, which is awesome, and I love it. And and you still have to have some fun on the side. So my husband and I cook a lot together. I'm a hiker, and I have a dachshund, which doesn't sound like the best hiking dog in the world, but he's like this little bitty dog. He's awesome, but he's the best hiker in the world. So we'll go for long hikes together, and he gets dirty, and we have a great time. I make bath products for fun, which is weird, but it's actually something I started doing with my daughter Kirsten. When she was still alive, and we'll get to that story here in a minute. But and it's something that I carry on as something that she really loved, but it's become a comfort for me, and it's become one of the ways I help bring comfort to other people.
Right, it does.
It does.
I will let you know that it does. You have blessed me and the women for the retreat. Right. We did
right. Just little things
year.
That we do. So and outside of that, it's just I love being with my friends and singing and dancing and. Just celebrating life every day.
I love it.
Every day.
I love it. Okay, so now let's talk about your daughter. I love her name.
Kirsten.
Yeah. And so tell us the story about what happened with your daughter and help us to understand. Go ahead.
Sure. And so, this was day after Thanksgiving, and it was in 2009. And we had just had this marvelous Thanksgiving. So we were at the time just starting to foster a young woman by the name of Heather, who is now my adult daughter,
Mm-hmm.
but she was 14. She'd just come into our home. She'd been there for about 6 months, and it had just been our first Thanksgiving together as a
Wow.
family, right?
Mhm.
And it had been this splendid day. We had about 14, 18 people. There was a lot of people showed up. And it had been joyful, and it had been peaceful. And I actually had just written this blog post to say, I got through Thanksgiving with no catastrophes this year. Like, that never happens.
Right.
And so it's the day after Thanksgiving, and Kirsten, who was 9 years old at the time, and Heather and I went ice skating. So it was Friday night. And Kirsten at the time was a Pee Wee hockey player. And she was this big, robust kid. I mean, she was just this totally gonzo, as only a 9-year-old could be, sort of living out loud kid. And we were skating, and there were hundreds of people at the rink. And she was being a typical 9-year-old. And I was trying to teach Heather how to skate, so I've got hold of her hands, and I'm skating backwards and trying to get her to skate. And Kirsten, in normal 9-year-old fashion, is literally skating circles around us backwards, you know. And she finally gets bored with that and takes off across the ice. And we've been there maybe an hour or so. And Heather looked up over my shoulder, and she said, "Kirsten's down." And I said, "What do you mean down?" "Well, she fell down on the ice." And I said, "That doesn't happen. She doesn't fall down."
Mm.
And so I turned around and looked, and she was down on all fours. And she looked up at me, and I went like this. And she went, she just nodded back. So I turned back to Heather. And about 15 seconds later, she said, "She's not getting up." And so I skated across the ice to her. And she was unconscious. And as I lifted her up, she died. Her heart simply stopped beating without any warning in a matter of about 3 minutes. And that's how we start.
Wow. And that's when life changed.
And that's when life changed.
That moment, so quickly.
It was instantaneous.
Mm-hmm.
It was instantaneous. And it was interesting because you go through these motions
Mm-hmm.
while you're in a crisis situation like that.
Mm-hmm.
A woman was at the rink who was a nurse
Mm-hmm.
and kind of almost literally slapped me back into reality and said, "We've got to do CPR."
Mm-hmm.
And as a parent, there are a few things you know instinctively, and one of them is your child's energy.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very clear to me that she was gone already. But you go through those motions. And this feeling as I went through that of the sand shifting out from underneath me and knowing that I was never going to be on level ground again, or at least I didn't think so.
Right.
Right? At the same time as having this, for me, and we can talk about it later, this sort of spiritual epiphany that went along with that.
Mm-hmm.
And that process of, in that moment, a million things going through your mind, but one of them is, how am I going to do this?
Right.
How am I going to do this?
And that's where I want you to go for us. How did you get through those early days, those early moments? Because it happened so suddenly. I mean, the way that you described Thanksgiving Day, life was great.
Yeah.
The sun was shining. There was laughter.
Beautiful day, yeah.
Right. And to then the next day, not even 24 hours later, life is changed for you drastically. And so
right,
how did you get through those initial moments? And tell us about your family with your husband and your daughter, your new foster daughter as well.
Who's gosh, this poor kid, stood
Right.
on the ice, watched me doing CPR.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And we go from this feeling of, we've got this family
Mm-hmm.
of 4 people,
Right.
and she's in this good, stable place, right? And then this happens. And you find yourself saying, and it's not, this is, and people lose other people all the time, right? I mean, that happens all the time.
It happens
People
every
die,
day.
and sometimes people die very suddenly. Doing it in such a public way, and you said, how do you get through those first few days? And so, the first day is just shock, and that, that sort of, I there are these things that I feel like I need to do, right? Things like, trying to say to myself, how am I going to explain to my husband that she's gone? And making that phone call to say, I'm going to, you need to meet us at the hospital.
Right.
And he goes, is it okay? And I said, you just need to meet us at the hospital, right? And so we get there, and there's that, that hideous moment. And for us, we'd been in such a big public place, and all these people are watching,
right,
as this takes place, right? And I get to the hospital, and there are all these people at the hospital, and there are all these people from the hospital who are there, and there are people from the skating rink who are at the emergency room, and they're in the lobby. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do with all these people, right? Well, the offshoot of that is that it ends up being this very public thing, which I wasn't prepared for. Nobody's prepared for, right? And you get up the next morning, and it's on the front page of the paper. And I think that that's the difference. There are a lot of people who walk through grace, and walk through grief with what you call grace, what we might more objectively call resilience, right? You build that resilience. And people exercise resilience in the face of trauma all the time, right? What doesn't normally happen is you don't normally do it in this very public forum. Right? And so you talk about getting through those first few days. Well, for me, it was so surreal because in addition to kind of getting through all the normal things that you have to get through, the families all showing up, and you have to, you do all the things you're supposed to do. You clean the caskets, and you call the funeral home, and you've got all these tasks, which I think are a bit of a blessing. All those tasks and all these rituals that you go through after a death, I think are there to kind of give you something to do, right? But in the middle of it, I'm coming home from the funeral home, and Channel 5's in my driveway.
Right.
And Channel 8's in my father's driveway. And Channel 19 is in my father-in-law's driveway, literally, and they're interviewing you. And you're trying to figure out, how do I spin this in a way that makes this healthy for everybody, right? And you feel like, at least for me, I felt like, okay, I'm gonna have to stand up now and be a big girl and talk to the people and trying to figure out what that message needs to be, right? And for me, part of it was this discussion that I had with my priest afterward, and we had just gotten a new parish priest. He'd started, 2 weeks earlier, and I met him for the first time in the hospital, standing across my daughter's body.
Wow.
Right? And the next day, I'm sitting in his office, and he looks at me and he says, I have a confession to make. And I thought, okay. This is a bit of a turn.
This is your first funeral.
He goes, this is the first time I've ever buried a child.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
He goes, and this feels like so much evil.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know why. And so this is part of that spiritual epiphany. And I said, Father, I see grace here. And let me tell you why. Evil takes your child over the course of 5 months with a disease that causes her pain and causes all of you suffering. I said, she was laughing 3 minutes before she died. And I know it because I was there.
Right. She was doing something that she thoroughly enjoyed. You said she was
She had a blast.
Circles.
She's laughing,
Right.
and so, and for me, it became that moment to say there is, I guess it was the thing that tethered me, is to say there is grace here. There is grace here. And the thing that I kept coming back to, and so, I'll kind of give you a preview of what we might get into later, but I told you that I picked her up off the ice and she was unconscious,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Her heart was still beating, however erratically. I could still catch a pulse, but she wasn't there. Her spirit was no longer in that body, despite the fact that there was still some mortal piece that was hanging out. Now, you go through this whole discussion growing up about faith and about there's this afterlife, right? And what is your spirit? And, what is that exists before and within and beyond you?
Mm-hmm.
For me, it was this very tangible feeling that she was gone before the mortal body had died, which gave me this weird, and I will tell you, in the midst of all of this chaos, of all of this, while people are yelling and screaming and calling 911, and someone's trying to get me started CPR, and there was this feeling of profound peace in the middle of it. And it was the weirdest thing I've ever felt in my life. And it was the most comforting thing that I've ever felt. And so I was left with this feeling that, and I said to my priest, God must have had someplace else for her to be. Now, is that, who knows? But for me, that was that thing that I held on. So you said, how do you get through that immediate,
right?
That very, very first immediate, those first couple of days.
So
and it was that faith that I knew she was in an okay place. I didn't worry about where she ended up. I knew that she didn't suffer. So I had that grace, right? And I knew that she was someplace good. And I could feel that goodness as she left.
And the way that you describe the early days, you, Beth, provided strength to everyone else, right? You were there for your husband. You were there for your daughter, Heather. And in the midst of the crowd of people that wanted a piece of you, wanted to hear the story, you're going through this grieving process so publicly as you describe it.
Yeah.
But yet you're ministering to these people. I mean, you ministered to the priest that you had just met who would be doing the service for your daughter. You're ministering to him. You're being strong. At least this is what I am hearing. Right? From the
it was
outside.
Very imperfect. So, it wasn't pretty the whole time.
No,
right?
Sure
And
it
it never
wasn't.
is.
Right.
Right?
It never is. But from the outside of what I am hearing, and I've heard you tell this story before, not into this detail, but from the outside, it looked as if you were being the strength for everyone else. You're making decisions about the funeral. You're telling your husband. You're keeping your family together, and then you're ministering to the priest. You were the strength, Beth.
Aung San Suu Kyi.
I'm sorry, what?
Aung San Suu Kyi. So the human rights activist.
Yes.
One of my favorite quotes that's been attributed to her. I don't know if she actually said it, but it's attributed
to her.
When you're helpless, help someone.
Yes. Very famous.
And it's a very real thing.
Right.
Now, let me be clear. I also spent a lot of time keening and crying.
Thank you for being honest.
And it was not graceful, okay? I swore at a lot of people. I made up new curse words. I swear to you, I made up new curse words. So I cried and I threw up and I cried some more and I didn't wash my hair. Okay. I described to someone early on that what it felt like was trying to be a spider walking with 5 legs. Like, you know what? When we were 7, there's always that jerk kid down the street that used to catch the daddy long leg spiders and then sit down in front of the group of girls playing dolls and then pull the legs off of them while we all screamed. I don't know if they were in your neighborhood.
No,
there was always at least one of them in my neighborhood.
No.
Okay.
never saw that experience. Just so
For real? Okay. No, but there was always that. I don't know. There's always to my experience, there's always one jerk kid who does that, right? And I remember. I remember saying to my husband Steve, I said, I feel like a spider trying to walk around with 5 legs.
Wow.
Like you're moving You're going through some kind of motion. Heaven knows what it is.
But you're trying to figure it out as you take your
But
steps.
it's not working.
Right.
And I want to be over there, and I keep going this way.
Right.
Okay, so it's not graceful.
Mm-hmm.
And it is never smooth. It is never graceful. You find those things that you can do, and you tether yourself to those positive things that you can do.
Mm-hmm.
I actually found myself in those first few days, and this is from the day that she died, for those first probably 4 days until we actually got her buried, asking myself, what would Jackie Kennedy do right now?
Why Jackie Kennedy?
Because she struck me as being this person who somehow managed to pull her act together, and whatever else was going on behind closed doors, by golly, she made it work.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Okay.
And I thought, especially if I'm going to have news crews showing up,
Okay.
all right, we're going to make this a positive lesson if it kills me.
So let's go there. So what are the positive lessons that you've learned through what you've described as a traumatic, very public experience? What are those lessons? Because I think about the men and women that are watching, that are in the midst of this right now, or it's bringing back a memory of something that has happened.
Right.
And so what are the lessons that you've learned to help them get through it?
I don't know if anything gets you through those first few days. I accept comfortable shoes and drink plenty of water.
Okay.
I mean, for real. Okay. Keep drinking water.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody offers to cook you a meal, by golly, take them up on it. And I don't care if it's 6 months later. Somebody wants to bring you lasagna, you bring me that lasagna. But, you want to come over and we'll mop my floors?
Let them do it.
You come on. I'm seriously. You know what? You take help. Don't be proud.
Mm-hmm.
Well, be proud, but don't be proud. You want to be proud to say, I'm going to be authentic to myself, and I'm going to be authentic to my emotions, and I'm going to stand up in a way that my mother would be proud of if she saw me, right? But if somebody offers to help you,
let them help.
Let them help you. That's their ministry to you.
And that's an important message, because when someone experiences traumatic like this, a trauma like this, people around you want to help, but they don't know how to help.
Right.
And so they come over bringing food, bringing money, answering the phone, helping clean up. Those are ways that they suffer with you, and they try to be helpful, because we don't know what to say. And I think the words actually get us in trouble when people come over and they start trying to console you. It's like, please stop.
God has a plan.
Right.
I was like, you know what? God did not plan for this. Right? I got news for you.
You say those words aren't helpful.
Those words are not helping me. Well, no, you know what you do? You say, I'm sure, and you move on, right? Because one of the things that happens is you get, and we've all been through this too, you find yourself in a traumatic situation and you feel anger.
Right.
And that's a very real, authentic feeling.
Absolutely.
It's the second feeling. Anger's never your first emotion, right? So you feel helpless, you feel frustrated, you feel exhausted, you feel deep sadness. Those are all very difficult emotions to process in the moment. So anger's super easy. So I can just call you a jerk and move on.
Right. And can completely justify it because I'm angry,
justify it because I got trauma going on.
Right.
So I can take it out on you, and that's all good.
Exactly.
And it's not. And yet we're still all going to do it at least once. Okay. And so kind of that's those first few days. And like I said, I immerse myself in the ritual and the role. I have a role to play. What would Jackie do?
You wrote it on your hand?
What would Jackie Kennedy do right now?
Okay.
I wrote it. I was like, Jackie would now stand up and go greet the people coming in the door. So let's go do that. Jackie would double check her makeup. Because
it's running.
Because I'm running again. The tough part is what happens 2 weeks later, or 6 weeks later. Getting through those first few days, everybody gets through the first few days.
You're surrounded by people, and this is what many of us don't understand, because everybody shows up the moment somebody dies.
Yeah.
And right up into the funeral.
Right.
They're there. But then we all go back to our regular lives.
That's exactly
and you're
right.
left there as the loved one trying to figure out, okay, how now does life go on? What is my new normal? Because everyone's gone.
Right.
And so then I believe you really start the grieving process because you're trying to find that routine, but that person isn't there. The memories are flooding. And then the sadness that you described, I think,
Right.
bubbles up. And I'm talking about from my own experience of dealing with the loss of my dad, and recently in 2018 the loss of my uncle, one uncle in
Right.
July and
Right.
my other uncle in December, and it's like didn't expect any of that to happen, but now everyone's gone back to their regular
Right.
life
Right.
and their regular routine, but the loved one, that immediate loved one,
Right.
is left to try to figure it out. So tell me, what happens a week and 6 months after?
So this is interesting. So that's when I made a decision. So I want to say it was, again, for me it was unique because it was so public, right? So I got letters and cards and emails from people I didn't know. And I got letters and cards from people who had lost their children 9 and 10 and 15 years earlier, who were saying things like, I lost my daughter 15 years ago and it still hurts just as much and I'm thinking about you. Right? And I got a lot of those. I got a lot of those messages. And as I said, I'm scrambling around like a wounded spider, and I'm thinking to myself, oh my stars, don't let me be that person. They're still here 15 years later. I am not going to be here 15 years later. I am not.
And when you say
going
not
to,
going to be here,
I'm
talking
not going
emotion.
I'm not going to be in this emotional space
Okay.
15 years from now.
Okay.
That is not going to that is not going to be my story. Okay? Because honestly, at the time, it was a selfish thing because I couldn't imagine living with that kind of pain for that long. Now, in retrospect, I can look back. I'm almost 10 years from the time that this happened, and I can look at those messages and frame them very differently,
Okay.
right? And think, this was just well intentioned. But I'm actually a little bit grateful that I misinterpreted it in the moment because it gave me this goal. And I set it out as a goal. I am not going to let this end my life.
Okay.
And so coming off of that, I think there were a couple of lessons that came off of that. One of them was the very first day I went back to work, and it was about 3 weeks after Kirsten died. I'm driving into work and I'm listening to NPR, right? And the rabbi Harold Kushner was on, and he wrote when bad things. People know him. He wrote when bad things happen to good people, right? And everybody knows the book. They don't necessarily know him, but he's giving this interview, and they're asking him about people who struggle with getting through grief, right?
Interesting.
And in particular, he's talking about, for example, if someone loses a child, they go, why did God take my child? And it's a very natural, why, especially something like with Kirsten dying, where there was no explanation. She simply died with no real explanation. I can give you some theories, but we don't know why, honestly. And so he said, the thing that we need to wrap our heads around is that God does not bring us grief and trauma. God does not take our children from us. Biology does that. Accidents do that. Ill intentions from other people do that. Where God reveals himself is in what we do next. And I remember hearing it on the radio and being so struck by it. I was on 480, I had to pull off the road and just take a second for that to sink in and say, this is where I look for guidance. And so I went from, standing in the hospital with my mother, looking at her saying, how am I supposed to do this, Mom? And having her say, I don't know. To being able to reach inside to my faith, okay, to reach for that higher power, and I don't care if you call it God or Jehovah or Allah or Yahweh or, that which exists before us and through us and beyond us, and say, give me the strength, give me some guidance, help me know what to do next. And so that's where the prayers go. You spoke earlier about people who get stuck, right? And it's an easy thing to do, right? So when something really traumatic happens to us, and it's rarely just one thing, right? Because trauma to a certain extent begets more trauma. And you and I have both been through that, and you know, we can talk about what comes next, right? But when something traumatic happens, you have a decision to make, and it is, what role is this trauma going to have in my life, right? And how is this? How am I defined afterward? And I think where people get stuck is most of us, and I think I did until I started having to deal with, it's a lesson that took a while to come out, but I came to this realization that we think about grief as learning to deal with the absence of this loved one, right? That's not what you're learning. What you're learning is how to define yourself and what your relationship with the person who's left is going to be.
And you know, I find
in the
it
absence of this loved one.
Yes. So I think it's a combination of that. Because when you look at death, the loved one is gone. It's not like the movies where they're coming back or they're showing up for the red carpet event. They're actually gone. Right. And so grief is learning how to live without them. And then the other part of it is defining who I am going to be and how life will evolve from that. So I think it's a combination of both.
It could be, yeah. Well, but I mean, you know, a lot of how we define ourselves, frankly, is in these relationships, right? I'm a mother. I'm a wife. I have this career. I'm an aspiring writer. Okay? If any one of those things is gone, now what's left is, how do I define myself now? Who okay, and if you don't have a good relationship with that person before you lose your loved one, you're going to get stuck trying to do that redefinition afterward. And so what I find oftentimes with people who have complicated grief, or what they call, you know, the technical term in psychology is adjustment disorder.
Right, they're not adjusting.
I can't adjust to this new normal, right? And it's because they have not learned to have that positive relationship with that person who's left. And that's fundamental. That is fundamental. I mean, if you want to kind of get down to brass tacks on like, how do you build resilience, right? The first and most important thing you need to do is acknowledge your relationship with yourself. And when we get tied up in our relationships with ourselves, and that's not in an unhealthy way, it's normally based around guilt and shame, right? I actually think guilt is a pretty good thing. I think guilt can be very healthy. Maybe because I'm Catholic, which is basically guilt. So. It's guilt with candles, right? You know, but you know, Brene Brown talks about this, right? You know, guilt is I am sorry for the things that I do. Shame is I'm sorry for the things that I am. Right? Two different things. Now, you can look at guilt, and what's nice about guilt is you can objectively say, I either did this thing or I didn't, or I was responsible for this thing or I wasn't, right? But you can also make amends for guilt. If I did something wrong, I can make amends. Shame is a different beast, and so a lot of grieving well, a lot of building resilience is learning to let go of shame. And sometimes you've got the tools to do that, and sometimes you need help. And I actually think everybody needs help. So as much as you talk about me being all well adjusted and dealing with this gracefully, I spend a lot of time in therapy. I mean, don't kid yourself, right? And it's a really important thing to do. Right,
it is. And I want to make certain, because we've got to wrap it up, but I want to make certain that when we talk about dealing with grief gracefully, it is not giving the impression that you've got it all together.
Oh no,
it's not.
It's not.
And I don't want the audience to walk away with that. It is about growing through it, versus getting stuck in it.
That's exactly right.
And so that is really the larger message. And I don't want to people to think that it has to be perfect and you look put together and you say the right things and you do the right things, because that's not grace. That's not.
No, that's an act.
Right,
We
that is
call,
an act.
We call that acting.
Right.
And I did a lot of it. I mean, don't kid yourself. I did a lot of it.
Right.
I did a lot of sort of, I mean, I used to joke about, I walk around with a tissue, a tube of mascara in my pocket all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
And I was, for me, it came down to intentionality.
Right.
I was very intentional about my grieving. Not everybody does that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my husband will be the first one to say, you are not normal. But I actually think that everybody can learn some intentionality as part of their self-care, right?
And that's a good point about self-care and being intentional,
Yeah.
whether we're dealing with grief or not. And so I want to get into, and thank you so much, Beth, because you have shared an abundance of information and you shared your story. But I want to shift for the last part, because we only have a few more moments, is to talk about celebrating life.
Oh, yeah,
Because
absolutely.
you celebrated your daughter's memory, which would have been her 18th birthday.
Right.
And you did something that I think is fun and special, and it's like something that you'll always have with you as you remember your daughter. So please tell us what you did for her 18th birthday.
I actually celebrate Kirsten's memory a lot of different ways, and I actually find a million little ways to do it. But when she turned 18, so my husband, my husband after she died had this huge memorial tattoo put on his back, and it basically covers his entire back.
Okay.
And so I've always talked about sort of, I mean, I've got a lot of little things that are kind of all over my life, but I always thought, maybe I always thought maybe I should get a tattoo. I mean, and so for her 18th birthday, the original plan was that her best friend and I were going to go together to get tattoos.
Mm-hmm.
Her best friend, Serena,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to go get tattoos. But she joined the Air Force, and actually, she's in Okinawa.
So
We kind of virtually did it. So I have a little cat tattoo behind my ear of her favorite Miyazaki character that I got on Kirsten's 18th birthday, which would have been the first time she could have got it.
Mm-hmm.
But I also got the words joy and thrive put on my arms.
Right.
And these...
I don't know if the camera can get up
Can
to
you get
that.
these?
See that? Thrive.
Yeah.
I love it. I love
So-
it. And I remember the first time I saw this, I thought that you had written on your arm. And I'm like, Beth, what is that?
Why did you write that on your arm?
And then the other arm, if you can show that, is joy.
It's just joy.
Right. Thrive and joy. So you got tattoos with the words thrive.
These are my daily
and
reminders.
joy. Okay.
Right? Now, it's not, because I made a decision to thrive a long time ago.
Again, being intentional.
But it's about being intentional. For me, these are my living testaments to what's God did not put us on this earth to just get through life.
Right.
I mean, you hear people say, "Man, I'm just trying to get through life."
Mm-hmm.
That's not why we're here. We're not here to just get through life.
Right.
You are here to live and to celebrate each and every day that we're given, because we're going to learn through each travail that hits us, right? And it's the whole thing about you better get busy living or you're going to get busy dying, right? And the fact is that even when you get crushed, and like we talked about, it's, for me, losing Kirsten was the first of probably a dozen, really, really, really tough setbacks. But there is joy to be found in every day, no matter what, and that is what we thank God for every day.
Right.
All right, I'm me, I'm very faithful. And I'm also pretty secular. And I always feel like if you can't make fun of organized religion, you're taking yourself way too seriously, right? And so I'm very spiritual.
That's a whole nother conversation.
It's a whole different conversation. It is totally different. But the fact is, faith in our greater spirit is so important to me. And people go, how can you reconcile that with this fairly secular lifestyle that you live, and with this? You're a scientist, right? Like you know how to clone things, like and my answer is no, because that spiritual self and that joy comes from something other than this group of cells that we've got bouncing around here.
Right. And
it
I
is
think
the
about,
vessel. We use this as our vessel to carry our spirit and to carry our faith and to carry that which is going to go to a beautiful space after we leave this one. Right?
And I think that this
so
goes
important.
to our scripture text because, you
Yes.
know, for me, I get caught up in the word of Yahweh. That for me is my foundation. And so it's not this grandiose spiritual conversation, but it really is, what does the word say?
Right.
Because that helps me stay connected to Yahweh, my creator, my father. And so when I'm going through a traumatic experience, however I define it,
Right.
I like to go to the word.
Sure.
And that's where I find my comfort, and that's where I find my guidance, and that's where I find the strength to go on, because the word says that he will never leave us nor forsake us in the midst of all of this, and that he is my refuge, an ever-present help in times of trouble. And so for me, that's where the comfort is. And I think that the message that I want people to understand is that you've got to figure out what's your anchor. Because in the storms of life, in traumatic events, you need something that is going to anchor you and keep you grounded. And for each of us, it's something different. Right. And so for me, and for what I really want to relate to the audience, is making certain that whatever your faith is, whatever you believe, that you're grounded in it, because that is what's going to carry you through the difficult times in life. It's not going to be an affirmation that you say. It's not going to be some spiritual theory. It's going to be something that you know and that you truly believe, and that keeps you grounded and anchored. And that is the message. Figure it out for yourself. I can't tell you what it is. Beth can't tell you what it is. You've got to figure that out. But for me, it is Yahweh, my Father,
the faithful
Yeshua, his Son, and most importantly, the Holy Spirit, because that is where my strength comes from. And I want to get to our scripture text. Which is so important, because our theme, and you've already talked about, is celebrating life. We're starting off 2019 celebrating life, focusing on all the wonderful things that we have. And the scripture text, my absolute favorite, is Psalms 118:24, and it says, "This is the day that the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it." And I always add, I will choose to rejoice. Because when I think about this topic, it may be hard for me to rejoice. It may be hard for me to muster up in my spirit to rejoice, but I'm going to choose it anyway, because that's my anchor, right? That's my anchor. And so I choose to rejoice. So tell me, in a very few words, Beth,
if I can do that.
What does the scripture text mean to you?
It means that for me, it means there's always a reason to feel grateful.
Always.
And God brings us that capacity for grace and gratefulness. And we should be thankful for it every day, no matter what else is going on. No matter what else you got going on, you can find something to feel grateful for.
Amen.
And that needs to be your intention and your guiding light.
Right. I love it. I love the intention and your guiding light. Find something.
Find it.
To be thankful for. Find something to give thanks to Yah for, because no matter what is going on, and you're talking from your traumatic experience, and no matter what is going on, find something to be thankful for. Amen. That is a testimony, Beth. It really is. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing it.
Thank you.
Because our pain has a purpose.
It does.
And it is to help us help somebody else, right? And when we keep our stories like this to ourselves,
it doesn't help anyone.
It doesn't help anyone.
No.
And this is how you celebrate her life, Kirsten. This is how you celebrate her legacy, by being able to help someone else. I think about early in the days when you were receiving letters from people who had lost their loved one 15, 10, 5 years ago. This was their legacy and pouring into you, so that you could then pour into us.
You gotta pour it out.
poured out. So thank you. Now, I always end the show with now what? Now what, Lord, is a prayer that I find myself always praying when I've learned some new information, or I'm at a crossroad, or I'm trying to figure something out, or something unexpected has happened. Now what, Lord? What would you have me to do? How am I to live differently because of this information? I don't know where you are right now, but I do know that you've received some new information that's either for you or it's for you to pass on to somebody else. We have to love one another and be graceful in the midst of the storms. And one way of doing that is to share this information. And so pray. Take the time to pray and ask, now what, Lord? What do I do with this? And then maybe there's something that you need to do. Reach out to a loved one, reach out to a counselor, reach out to your pastor. If you find yourself stuck in the midst of grief, because that is not the way to thrive, and that is not the way to live gracefully through grief. And so I pray that you've been blessed by this conversation. I have. I know we could have talked, Beth, from now on for another hour, but we don't have that much time, right? Right. So I hope that in the time that we've had, that you've been blessed by this conversation. And next week's show, we're going to continue and to look deeper into the scripture text. What does the scripture text tell us about grief? And what are some practical steps that we can take as we find ourselves dealing with this and growing gracefully through it? Beth gave us one. She said, drink lots of water and wear comfortable shoes. I would say ditto to that. And so I look forward to our time next week together. And again, thank you for spending your Sunday afternoons with me. I am blessed with you being here, and I'm blessed by this platform. Thank you, Brother Larry Bishop, for allowing us to have this opportunity. You guys be blessed until we come back together again next time.